Hello, greetings. What a treat to see you all here. My name is Deborah Cullinan. I am the Vice President for the Arts here at Stanford, and I am just thrilled to have you all here with us. I'm going to be reading tonight because I have some things that I don't want to forget. But we are here for Keynote conversation between Cathy Park Hong and Jen Liu, moderated by Marci Kwon, which I know we are all so excited about. This is the culmination of an extraordinary, I would say momentous, 2 days, the symposium IMU UR2. And I just want to take a second to just feel that. And for all of you that have been along for the ride, let's just give like a big clap. Like, amazing. As I said yesterday, as part of the opening of the public component of this convening, this is part of the Asian American Art Initiative here at Stanford University, and this initiative has been imagined, co-visioned, and led by the extraordinary Elisa Alexander and Marci Kwon. I will also say I'm new here. I've been here about 8 months, and I'm learning a lot. And I will say, Elisa and Marci, from you, I have learned what it is to believe that something can be possible and to just put it the fuck on the table and insist that it get done. And I'm here as part of the leadership of Stanford and to say that this is not a sideshow. This is not a moment in time. This is a commitment, and as I said yesterday also, this builds on generations of work, and we are so grateful to all of you for what you have done to build on Asian American scholarship and activism and art and creativity, and especially to those who are not here with us now, who were here, who helped to contribute to this as well. It is so important to recognize that it takes generations to make the kind of change we want to make in the world. So just a big thank you. And then my job is to make sure that you know about the people that we want to acknowledge as partners and supporters and those that help make this possible. So this program is organized by the Cantor Arts Center, collaborated with the Institute for Diversity in the Arts and Stanford Live, and it was funded by the Stanford Arts Incubator pilot program. The symposium was made possible through support from the Terra Foundation for American Art. And now here, I don't usually love to read lists, but I really love reading this one because it's the beginning of a list that I know will get so much longer and bigger and more robust. It's the list of partners that came together to make this possible, and it articulates just what it means when we say we're better together than we are apart, and when we come together, we can do great things. So I want to make sure that we are acknowledging all of the co-sponsors. So the American Studies Program, Center for Asian Health, Research and Education, Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, Center for East Asian Studies, Center for South Asia, Department of Art and Art History, Department of East Asian Languages and Culture, Department of History, Stanford Medical Humanities and the Arts Program, Stanford Program in Modern Thought and Literature, as well as Christine Chan and Bryant Lin. So again, can't wait to read that off next time around, and it's going to be that much bigger. And before I introduce to you the amazing Marci Kwon, I do want to do one more end-of-day shout-out to the people who have really worked their tails off to make this happen. So in addition to Elisa, Marci, and all of the staff, a special shout-out to Ellen, O, and Eddie Dye. So Marci Kwon is Assistant Professor of Art History at Stanford University and co-director of the Cantor Arts Center's Asian American Art Initiative. She is the author of Enchantment, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism from Princeton in 2021. And Marci, I don't know where you're coming from, but I'm very, very excited to welcome you to the stage.
Okay, wow. Thank you everyone so much for being here. This is an amazing turnout. So to begin, I want to acknowledge that Stanford occupies the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Today, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe seeks federal recognition and the restoration of its stolen homelands. The Asian American Art Initiative supports these petitions and urges you to visit muwekma.org for more information. Leland Stanford created this university with wealth generated by the Transcontinental Railroad. Built in large part by Chinese migrant laborers, the railroad was a, quote, core infrastructure of continental imperialism, in the words of historian Manu Karuka, and enabled the theft of indigenous land and violation of indigenous life. There is no separating the history of Stanford, the histories of Asian America, and the histories of American imperialism, exclusion, and racism. They are one and the same. So welcome to the keynote event for IMU UR2, the launch event of the Asian American Art Initiative, co-directed by myself and Elisa Alexander. The Asian American Art Initiative is dedicated to the collection, preservation, research, teaching, and publication, or public presentation of Asian American and diaspora artists and makers. So through a series of long-term installations, special exhibitions, research and education projects, the AAAI fosters in-depth scholarly and public engagement with artists and makers of Asian descent. So like Deborah, I have a lot of thank yous. Thank you to everyone for being here in the midst of an ongoing global pandemic. Thank you to all of the elders and activists who've struggled for Asian American lives in art, including Stanford's class of 1991. Thank you to AAAI advisors, Mark Dean Johnson and Gordon Chang, as well as Margot Machida, who are just three of the people who've been doing this work for decades, and who've also been invaluable interlocutors. Thank you to all my students who were required to be here, sorry, not sorry, especially for taking time out on Halloween weekend. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my home department, Art and Art History, and especially all of my colleagues, and the two chairs of our department since I've been here, Pavel Levy and Alexander Nemerov, for creating space for me to imagine what I would like art history to be. It's rare for a junior professor to have this kind of latitude, and I don't take it for granted. So when I was conceiving of this event, Cathy Park Hong was on the top of my list for this keynote conversation. Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning is a book that gave language to much of what so many of us had experienced, but were too scared, ambivalent, repressed, or ashamed to admit. Among other things in this book, Cathy writes about art, the artist Teresa Ha Kyung Cha, and her friendship with other Asian American women artists while she was in college at Oberlin, including the amazing Jen Liu, who's also here tonight, who is Erin in the book. Jen's videos, paintings, installations, and performances create fictional worlds to make concrete, and I think not just visible, but make haptic, graspable, the invisible, pervasive realities that structure many of our lives today. For example, in her own words, quote, "My current body of work, Pink Slime Caesar Shift, builds on a speculative proposal to build a secret information network for labor activists in China through the domestic food distribution grid, through inserting covert messages into the DNA code of in vitro beef hamburgers." And you'll be seeing slides from her work behind us. So when I asked Cathy and Jen to be in conversation tonight, I had in mind a phrase Cathy wrote in Minor Feelings, quote, "I crave to read about the friendships where women, and more urgently women of color, came of age as artists and writers." I asked them if they would like to speak about female friendship, as well as their own friendship and entwined lives as a poet and an artist. So our conversation today will begin with a reading by Cathy, followed by a conversation and then a question and answer session, which will run off of note cards. So there will be people who will be walking around with note cards. If you have a question, you can write your questions down and then give them to us. There'll be people around to collect them. So to frame our conversation, I would just like to offer a few brief thoughts about my own friendships with women of color. Caitlin and Layla, our text messages keep me sane. Shawan, you make me laugh and remind me that it's okay to believe in beauty. Jean, your rage gives me life and makes me feel okay about my own rage. And you know, this entire weekend and convening was organized by Asian American women. Ellen and Eddie, working on this convening together has felt different because of the trust than any other thing I've worked on, because of the trust, support, communication, understanding, and generosity you have shown me, a professor who is really, really bad at logistics. Jamie, I don't think female friendship needs to be between two female identifying people. Thank you for seeing me. And of course, Elisa Alexander, who curated the just absolutely amazing shows East of the Pacific and The Faces of Ruth Asawa, and who's been doing just like this heroic job, like working with artists and estates and raising money to have works conserved. You know, like doing this work without you would be impossible. I think our friendship is actually what makes the AAAI and all of this possible. And Casey, my sister, I love you. So with that, I'd like to invite Cathy Park Hong and Jen Liu to join me on stage. Thanks.
Hi. Before I read, I just want to say thank you to Marci and to the whole, and Stanford, and IMU UR2, everyone who is involved with this. It's just really, it's been like a historic, very special experience being here. And yeah, we're gonna have this conversation, and I will just say in advance that so much of this book, Minor Feelings, is also a product of our late night conversations that we had over drinks or over coffee, or which would always end up leading into arguments. So I'm very curious how this conversation is gonna go. I'm just gonna read a couple passages from An Education. I first met Erin at a high school art camp in Maine. Since it was my first time away from my family in Los Angeles, I thought I could escape my geeky status and become the bad girl I always wanted to be. In my arsenal, I had my combat boots and my Fugazi and pavement tapes and my pack of Marlboro Lights. But upon arrival, I knew immediately that I was out of my league, since the New York kids were nihilistically hip in that 90s Larry Clark kids kind of way. Erin was the most striking among them, a tall Taiwanese goth girl with an asymmetrical bob who wore a full-length charcoal vintage negligee and knee-length combat boots. Putting you on the spot, can you visualize? As huge as moon boots. Okay, I'll make it short. No. I was so intimidated by her, I avoided her. But we struck a hesitant friendship in drawing class because she liked my art. We kept our easels next to each other. We said nice things about each other's work. She would borrow my drawing pens, or I her masking tape. But once class was over, she paired off with her much cooler friend, while I retreated back to my glum basement dorm room to hang out with my white Southern roommate who had hung a giant American flag on her wall as a defiant act against all the East Coast pretensions around her. Once on a Saturday night, Erin asked me if I wanted to go paint. The RA, she explained, said she could use the empty room and she would like the company. I immediately said yes, although I'd never done such a thing as painting with someone else outside of class. Making art was an entirely private affair. I did it alone on weekend nights at home to escape from my life. To pin up unstretched canvas on a wall next to a friend in an empty room spotlit by clamp lights with New Order warbling from a tape deck felt too intimate, especially since we weren't painting anything from life, but painting from imagination. What was natural in private, sketching things out, stepping back to gaze at my painting, felt like a self-conscious act I was performing exclusively for Erin. I might as well have worn a beret and smock. But because I was acutely aware of the fact that I was playing the role of artist, my identity as an artist became real for the first time. I'll end there.
So great. So just to begin, I wanted to ask, how does it feel to be in conversation together today? And just so you know, when we hopped on Zoom together to talk about what we're going to talk about today, they were like, "Have we ever been on a Zoom together?"
We did Zoom cocktails, as all good friends do. I might actually start with a rebuttal. No. Well, every single friend has their own mythology about their really long, precious friendships, right? So my rebuttal would be what I said at your wedding before.
That's totally wrong.
Where I said that Cathy's mythology about my coolness, A, not true, B, that I always wanted to be friends with you, right? And I said that at your wedding. So that's just to say, there's a story in there while the story is being read.
The hazards of autobiographical writing.
Well, that's exactly
right?
it.
Everyone has their own take.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know. I remember you saying that at the wedding, and I was like, inside my head, I was shaking my head. I'm like, that's so not true. But here we are, competing. Talking about who was the less cool person.
So that's what it feels like.
Yes.
Amazing.
But to answer your question, it's weird, I will say. But I mean, Jen and I have been friends we're basically like family at this point because we met each other when we were 16 and we're still we're still friends. It's incredible. It's I have yet to process it. I mean, it's kind of strange. It's almost like we're kind of going public with our friendship, but it's like sort of being historicized in a way. But at the same time, we're also just having a conversation like we've done so many other times. So it's also very natural.
Yeah. Well. And I wanted to just open up by talking about your time at Oberlin, and we heard this amazing passage about the importance of friendship and your formation as an artist. But I was wondering if you could, Jen, if you have any thoughts about that time for you.
Sure. I mean, a lot of the memories are shared actually with Cathy. I mean, of course, whatever. I had my own things too, but I think that a lot of it has been said about just having a lot of free time, right, and kind of unformed time, and the kind of friendships that come out of that. And I think that the book actually speaks really well to this idea of co-formation, right? And that kind of space that it's a little rare after spaces like that. Yeah, what do you think, Cathy?
Well, I mean, I think when we're in college, we, there have been so many stories about female friendships that have come out within the last 10 years or so. But usually, what gets like highlighted, or your first heartbreak, or when you lost your virginity, or your boyfriend, and all of that and everything. But when in fact, when you're in college, the most just intense hothouse romance relationships are with your friends. It's just, it's often, it really kind of takes up your life, and I think it's so much of your growth, or my rite of passage, was from my friendships with you and other people at Oberlin, and so it was really important for me to document that. And going back to what you were talking about in your introduction, if we're going to kind of tie this to art and art and aesthetics, in writing this book, I was honestly looking at reading different books, reading different monographs of art movements in the past, and so much of it has been based on sort of Eve Sedgwick's idea of homosocial relationships, right? Like these relationships between men, these friendships that happen after hours, right? Like not after hours in bars and, in their homes over a women or what have you. And that's where the real networking happened. And it was from these drinking friendships that there were movements, there were actual manifestos, there were innovation that was, incubated from late night drinking and everything. And I was jealous, and I was like, I really wish that I was part of a group. I always wanted to be a part of a group. When I was in high school, I always wanted to be in a band, And then I was like, I really romanticized those movements like the Dadaists and the Surrealists and, and all of them. And then so I was thinking about that, and I was like, well, actually, I was in that kind of friendship in college, but I didn't think of it. That wasn't foregrounded to me. I was like, I had to think about it. I'm like, that was my friendship with Jen and Helen in the book. And I was like, and I was thinking about how male artists mythologize themselves all the time, even before success. They mythologize themselves, because they have that confidence, right? And I was like, well, what would happen? I'm just going to mythologize my friendship with Jen. I'm just going to do it. I don't care. I mean, I wasn't like this. I was writing Minor Feelings. I was an obscure poet, and I was like, I'm going to do it and see what happens. And but then I also realized that I couldn't mythologize it because I'm still friends with the people. Obviously, you thought I was doing some mythologizing there, but it's also, it wasn't just about going to parties and getting drunk and fucking and all of that. It was there was also a lot of emotional entanglement, and there was also the kind of subtext of, that we're Asian and where we come from because we're Asian, and that was all part of it. So it wasn't sort of the party life that I was reading about. It was much more intense than that, and it was really difficult to mythologize because of that. And I realized I had to kind of write into that knot as well.
But I think it's really important that I just want to throw in, and I think that this is a given, but in amongst all that emotional entanglement and coming of age stuff, it was a coming of age creatively. That's exactly the thing, and it was always merged with, from the very moment that we met, it was always merged with creative production and political, and a political awakening. Let's say that, right? Yeah, and but I suspect that we're not the only female friends, let's say, or Asian American female friends that have these kind of relationships that are so complex and have so many different aspects to them that are kind of like sort of becoming all at the same time. And my question, I guess, would be whether that's a lack of a kind of lack of interpretation, right? Or is it a lack of structural supports for that? Is it something that comes out of a certain lack of modeling of tethered to gender, right? And this idea that females or female friends should not be mythologizing, that there is no model for that, or a dearth of models for that. And we can go on with these kind of questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just curious about the, we were talking a little backstage about just like feeling like when, and I know I've had this feeling too, that when you're talking with another woman of color or Asian American woman, it's just like there's a feeling that you don't have to explain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just, that's something I'd like to kind of think more about, and why that's so important.
Right.
I mean, that was exactly why. In Minor Feelings, I talk about this Korean word called chung, right? That's, chung is like this immediate kind of recognition and connection that you have. Usually it could be, it's with family members, it's with friends, it could just be with someone who you just met, but it's like this, it's a little bit untranslatable, but it's this kind of like kinship that you feel. And that was what I had with Jen, and that was, and that's what I have with other Asian American friends and non-Asian American friends. But I think part of that chung is relaxing and not feeling like you have to explain yourself through to the white gaze, that like that Jen just knew what I was talking about when I would complain about my mother, and I think that was, and there's also I think there are a lot of like BIPOC groups that came out of that as well, where they feel that way. You're like, okay, part of this whole idea of a safe space is that you don't have to explain yourself. Yeah. People just know. But in terms of the friendship, I think what was really important was like, I just also wanted to, I think there's also this expectation that, especially if it's like BIPOC women, that there's like this kind of tidy feminist camaraderie, where you're like sort of upheld to the standard, and that it's more about empowerment more than anything else, which quite frankly gets boring, And what I was interested in also was like documenting or archiving, which has been a word that's been coming up a lot, archiving the mess, that it's not, which is also kind of, I guess you could say it's a feminist act in a way, but too, because it's like we collaborated together, we bickered together, it was just, I guess it's all in the book, right?
Oh, did I want to say something? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, we also talked in the back about like answers versus questions, and I'm going to totally indulge in the overproliferation of questions, right? If that's okay.
Great.
But I think I don't know. I think it's interesting to think about being able to bypass, right, and move beyond very, very quickly, like in conversations personally, right. Yeah. And I would be curious to know if that comes into play when, I don't know, in this context, let's say, Asian American artists get together and talk about Asian American art.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, whatever that is.
Whatever that is.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm actually quite interested in something that you just said, Cathy, about, not having to talk and route through whiteness. In relation to something that you said about a kind of political awakening, right, that was happening at that age too. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take that up a little bit.
Sure. Do you want to take it, Cathy?
Yeah, as you were saying, I just wanted to say, no, why don't you start, and then I'll add.
Oh, God. Just say it one more time, but really quick.
Yeah, so part of what was kind of said around, like at least for me, what's been so important about having these types of friendships is like, you can just like pick up and you don't have to explain, right? And what I'm realizing is, not having to explain means in some ways not routing through whiteness, right? You can just like talk, and then that to me has always been amazing because it allows for like more creativity, right? Because you don't have to like go through all this stuff, right?
Well, yeah,
first. So is that in relation to also something you were saying about like, the kind of political awakening that was happening for you at the time?
Yeah. Well, it went a lot faster. I mean, I think that was the thing. We're talking about speed bumps, right? And as far as we had like just enough people to kind of make a safe pocket, right? And we respect each other like so deeply, and really invested in each other's practice, right? So the kind of conversations we were having were like, I would actually argue were far advanced, far beyond what we could have done if we were in a kind of one-person vacuum, right? Or kind of in a different social circle.
Yeah, I think we were, I don't know if it was exceptional or it was part of that time, but I think a common sort of Asian American trope is the lonely Asian American, or the Asian American who grows up in a white town and feels isolated and feels alienated, right? And which is absolutely valid, and parts of my childhood was also that experience. As well. But for me, I think like when I was in college, it was not like that at all. And I think it's also probably for a lot of Asians who grew up in California or, you know, in big cities, it was, or, you know, go to Stanford or Berkeley, you know, it's the same. You're friends with Asians, you're friends with other, you know, people of color, and it's just comfortable. It's comfortable. But I think like when we went to school, it was the late 90s, and it was, you know, Oberlin was woke before everyone was woke. There was like, that was like just, I mean, it's constantly ridiculed in the news for being overly woke. And that was always the case. So like everything that's been happening the last few years, I went through that in college, you know. But what I had that I thought it was an exceptional experience at the time was that we had mentors who were Asian American and Black and Latinx, and we had I had friends. A lot of my friends were, poets and artists of color in college, and that was just normal. And it wasn't, you know, I think we were also very privileged because the first time I was really introduced to poetry was from taking a class with the poet Myung-Mi Kim, who's a language poet. And we took that class together. And that was also essential to sort of the ideas that we would just sort of ping pong back and forth. But, you know, what Myung-Mi Kim did, and this was like really foundational for me, was that I wasn't interested, you know, we've been talking a lot about representation and identity and so forth. For me, like writing art, politics was never just about representation or realistic depictions of identity, because I was taught early on to question that, because Myung-Mi Kim introduced us to Teresa Ha Kyung-cha, and her writing dictate is this is a quote by Paul Celan, who said, about Paul Celan, where he said, "Wounded by reality, he's searching for reality." And I think that was like what you could describe Teresa Ha Kyung-cha's book as that, wounded by reality, she's searching for reality. And it's like, it's about like, you know, she taught us early on that you can't, you know, the master's tools are insufficient. And out of that insufficiency, but it's also positive, you could spin that in a positive light, because it's deficient. That's why innovation is absolutely necessary. So innovation, artistic innovation, creative innovation had nothing to do with, it wasn't ahistorical formalism. It was out of historical, political, cultural necessity. And that was like imprinted in me early on. And I think when, you know, Jen and I were like, we collaborated once, which is horrible, but like, you know, it was more just exchanging ideas and so forth. It was always sort of founded on that idea, not, you know, we were always sort of kind of thinking through that, like more about sort of the practice in politics and aesthetics, where we used a racial identity as a way to kind of think differently, you know, or to quote Nate Mackey, who I quote in this book, you know, using our position as other to quote unquote other art or writing and so forth. And that was foundational. Yeah.
But I do want to say, though, I just want to remind us that it's not like we were in some kind of utopia, right? I think that very definitively within our little circle, there was a sense of friction or taking on a kind of resistance position, right? And we can talk about the 90s and all sorts of interesting things happening on campus, but there was also a really interesting kind of 90s, I feel like I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but a really particular kind of lefty, liberal, 90s toxic multiculturalism, right? As interpreted through, indeed, like the white gaze, the white voice, and then kind of like put out there as if it was going to be some kind of welcoming atmosphere, and in fact it wasn't, right? So, so we did a lot of important work together also in helping ourselves articulate, indeed, like a position of resistance, right? Couched in experimental form, in fact.
So do you think that resistance, were you resisting against that kind of toxic multiculturalism?
Part, not all. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard. I think, you know, this kind of toxicity of multiculturalism is more retrospective. It happened afterwards. Like, I wasn't thinking we're living in a multicultural era.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm just having an education, and I'm just like being depressed and living my life and trying to write a paper. And I was like, sure. And I was like, yes, I read Spivak at the time in college. And again, this was very much like a privileged liberal arts education. And I was like, oh my God, I guess this paper is due tomorrow. You know, and I guess, you know, my resistance is resisting writing that paper, you know, until the very last minute. But I think maybe to talk about sort of, it wasn't utopia, it was that it was still, I mean, you know, I really think when we're talking about like narratives or the different kinds of storytelling that's necessary, it was really important for me to talk about Asian communities, Asian American friendships, and so forth, because we're often so isolated when we're written about or when we write about ourselves. We're often so isolated, and when we are like, you know, and when there's many of us as a group, we're seen as a threat, right? Like the Asian invasion, the Asian horde, the Asians as a viral contagion, and so forth. And there was some of that too in college. You know, it's like,
I think that we were perceived a little bit like
yeah,
that.
we were considered an Asian invasion or the Asian horde and there were like 3 of us, right?
Yeah.
Because. Yeah, seriously, and because like, you know, I wasn't in that. It was less so. It was in the English department, but it was the art department was very white. It was very, very white. I mean, there were like, you know, a few faculty of color, but it was basically white bros, and then you and Helen were like sort of very ambitious, and weren't like. Refused to be in the shadows of these white bros, and you were considered a threat, you know. And it was like, and it's like when Asians are, if there's more than 2, if there are 3, and they refuse to be like these timid, you know, passive.
It might be slightly hypercritical.
It might be a little bit, yes, more than slightly hypercritical. But I mean, and also what was not utopic was, you know, Jen critiquing my writing or my art, which was like, she had this way of just destroying my ego, and I was like, was that really necessary?
Yeah. But you're better for
like,
it.
It's just like
you did so good.
I don't know. Is this tough love? I don't think so. You're just being a hater.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me, because as you were talking about it not being a utopian space, like, you know, I was thinking about like the high school experience I was telling you about backstage. I went to high school in Irvine, California. My high school was like 50% Asian American, and, you know, because within that there's just so much kind of difference, like in class, like immigration status. There was just like you couldn't, because I was in that environment, you couldn't like have a monolithic experience of Asian American. And there were tensions there, right? But I also am really interested in the fact that like your tensions were coming out around creative differences or around like creation. So that's something there are like 14,000 threads I want to pick up, and we'll get to them eventually. But that's something I want to just maybe ask about is like, the importance of each other's work to your creative practices, not just in your artistic formation, but like, coming in to this moment. And also I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, which was the collaboration that you tried out in college that I guess did not go very well.
I think the outcomes were fantastic.
Outcome was fantastic.
It was the process. It was the process. I take all the blame.
Well, we never collaborated again. Basically, Jen made me cry because we just had different, like, I forgot why you made me cry.
I know why.
Why did you make, it was because you you wanted to do everything last minute the night before. And I don't work that way. And
I was also really tired because I'd actually just done a collaboration with Helen. Mm-hmm. She used me all up. And then there was like nothing left.
Oh, yeah.
And then I wouldn't do anything because I was so tired. And then you got
you were
sick
burnt out.
too.
And I got really
so
sick
upset
and I was
you got
really
sick.
stressed out. But it was it was like pretentious. It was so pretentious what we did. But there was there was one, I'll just talk about, we were so pretentious, but that's okay. Yeah. I think we have a right to be pretentious. Everyone has a right to be pretentious.
Yes.
Cheers. So just to be more specific, what was this project? Was it a poetry art project?
No. So it was like an installation. So back in the 90s, like Anne Hamilton, if you remember, was like really all the rage. And so it was like this one video projection where it's so like it's kind of
it's
cheesy.
great. Actually, I think that's the best part.
It was a one video projection of one of us spitting fire.
No, both of us. We both learned how to spit fire.
Spitting fire. I know,
what was it, like 151?
Yeah, it was 150, and I had to do it like 10 times. So I thought my gums were just I had no gums at the end.
We were like,
yeah, so maybe that was also what instigated my crying.
But we can spit fire.
Yeah, so that was part of it, and I don't know. That's all I can remember.
No.
I don't want to go into this.
No.
Let us not open up this archive, Jen.
It was. We've been talking about archives for 2 days. So listen. So it was in the Asia. What was that building? It was
an Asia House.
It was an Asia House, which was a dorm, but it was also the partial archives of when Oberlin used to be a missionary school, particularly to China. So this was actually really important that we were there. Yeah. We were very thoughtful, pretentious children.
Yes, we were pretentious, very thoughtful.
And
we did our homework. Yes.
And it was about pages, lots of pages. We burned
there was
so
like
many
a burnt
pages.
page. It was and it was turned into some kind of
and we were
tape
super,
across the table.
And we were super into like durational performance, so you sat there for like 8 hours. With this like thing.
I'm going to have a grad student that writes about this and reads both of your work through, like this performance and dig up archives, and that's what we do.
Great.
Sorry.
Great.
We're making archives. Is that? Can you like? We're archiving.
Yeah.
Or is that the word?
We're archiving right now.
We're archiving. Yes.
Yeah.
So kind of speaking of historicizing and like that moment, you mentioned that you're like, we weren't like living through multiculturalism. We're just like, like going to school and like seeing all this stuff. And I, especially because there's so many students in the audience right now, but, one thing, like I keep on asking people, I'm like, tell me about multiculturalism, because I'm like, what happened in the 90s that there was, it seemed like this big kind of moment where, representation was a political goal, and then it just like completely like dissolved. And then we have this, this current moment. And I just feel like I'm searching for, some kind of sense of how to think about this present moment in relation to the kind of 90s and what lessons we can learn from that. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that moment.
Well, I have to admit that like the 90s didn't have the same kind of urgency and upheaval as now. So I'd be careful about comparing these two moments, you know? I mean, it was like, late 90s was kind of a period of prosperity. And also, this was like a small college in Ohio, so we were just always, what was happening at Oberlin was very late. We're just like getting the delayed effects of what was happening, if we're talking about culture, of what was happening in New York, so late that what was happening in Oberlin in the 90s was fashionable again now. I mean, we're just sort of stuck. But I would say that, it was around the time where I did read about like the 93 Whitney biennial, but I didn't think of it as exceptional. That's the thing. I just thought it was just my education. Like I was reading, my teachers were Johnny Coleman and Annette Macias. And what was really remarkable, as I was saying, was like just learning about conceptualism, for instance, through first learning about Adrian Piper, or reading about hybrid texts or whatever, first reading Jean Toomer, for instance, or Teresa Ha-Kyung Chow. But I thought there was nothing weird about that or strange about that. I thought this was the education I should be getting. And then it was kind of a wake-up. It was a little bit of a rude awakening upon graduation, and especially when I went to graduate school, that it was a period, it was actually a specific moment in history, and that it was now over. And so this is where I could use his moment as a historical moment and be cautious about and think about, well, what's going to happen now, right? Because this was actually happening in the late 90s, right? There was like Fukuyama's End of History. People were talking about post-race, and it was like people were talking about like, yes, there was like, and everyone, all critics were disparaging multiculturalism with good reason, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There were also really good aspects to it, but I think the way they were disparaging it was saying that it was just some kind of like cosmetic diversity, when it was actually more than that, and I think, where we did, studied race in conjunction with imperialism and Marxism and so forth, but that was the narrative that was spun. And then when I was in college and afterwards, it was like basically the return of this white art world, this white literary world, and even after 9/11, I would say, even after, because there was Obama, and during Obama's tenure, it was all about how we were post-race and everything. And my fear is that, we were talking about, Elise was talking about relevance, right? And my fear is that happening again, and how there's been this really kind of tense moment of racial reckoning that people are talking about. But the way the culture industry takes it is as, oh, we have to offer reparations, but it's a really kind of superficial form of reparation. So in the literary world, it's like giving an award to writers of color as a form of reparation. Or it's like, in the museum, it's still the board of directors, is still white, right? So they still have the control. And so a lot of, let's face it, a lot of these exhibitions are also based on white guilt, and so, and white guilt lasts for how long? It stops, it's finite, and that's what happened back then. It could happen again. So and I hear and I feel it when people during anti-Asian, with all this anti-Asian hate, there are, even while anti-Asian hate has been happening, I'd read headlines where it'd be like, is Asian American identity meaningless? Has it lost its use? Or, or was this all just, was this all just an illusion? Because with these big business media companies and so forth, they're all about sort of on to the next thing, on to the next narrative and so forth. And it's easy, to feed the content machine, right? And so I think it's really important that we continue that this energy is sustained and fed. So, I don't know.
I mean, this is where we can get into a generational conversation, particularly for our generation, right? We had a little taste of something very special in the 90s, right? Regardless of Oberlin or not or whatever, there was something special that happened in the early 90s. And then it was quickly absorbed and denied, right? As if it never happened, except within certain, academic departments, right? Other than that, it was just washed away. And that is what we came up with. And now, as fully formed grown-ups, right, it is our job, in fact, to correct the situation, in fact. The responsibility falls on us, right? To not undermine the possibility of extended discourse. It's our job to not undermine our own power and positions of power within institutions or outside of institutions, building different kinds of institutions. That's on us. That's our job, right? So that's one of the biggest differences, right? Is that it's actually embodied in us. Right? So we
and
have
all
to
of
do
you.
it. And all of you.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think is really striking in relation to this, to what was just said, was, Cathy mentioning before, learning about Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha, and the importance of abstraction being kind of and critiques of representation being embedded in your education, your kind of college education around kind of Asian American literature, like with the poet Myung-Mi Kim. And I was just wondering if you both could say more about that, because in a previous conversation, you mentioned that you were among the kind of earliest generations to be really affected by dictée.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could talk about, I think taking a class with Myung-Mi Kim and reading Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha was that from an early on, what was developed within me was to have an oppositional aesthetic, that was, and that like art was political, is political. I just took that for granted, because that was like, I was learning that at the age of 19. And I think there was this beautiful talk earlier today by Patrick Flores, where he talked about Asian American ontology being a luminosity, a kind of where he's striving for a luminosity. And, I don't know if I'm quite interpreting it quite right, but, he was saying that there was something. It's a kind of spiritual. He's seeing it as spiritual, and I just love that. This kind of luminosity. And I was thinking about dictée being luminous in that way, where one sort of aesthetic Myung-Mi Kim taught was this notion of silence, so that when speech acts are insufficient in capturing, say, trauma or these historical events, that you have to just allow for the unspoken, allow for the unsaid. And I think that, like, Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha did that in her book. And I thought, and she was saying, like, silence can also be a radical act. And I think because I was someone who grew up having trouble with the English language and growing up in a household where I didn't feel free to talk about my feelings, that was really quite powerful for me. And also that it was okay to be ineloquent, and that you could use that ineloquence in your poetry. And that gave me a lot of permission to write in all sorts of ways. And, Dictee, which is also a spiritual book, it's like a syncretic text that it combines Catholicism and shamanism and so forth, is also kind of, I feel like it achieves that kind of luminosity, that's sublime, that sense of sublime, yeah.
I mean, I don't have much to add to that, although I do want to add to the Patrick Flores love here. And I don't quite remember what was the term, but there was some beautiful turn of phrase, but it had to do with that this sort of, I don't want to call it a collapse, but this kind of layering, or this kind of like turning in upon itself. So this idea that you would paint people with eggs with egg tempera, right? Or you would there's some kind of like bringing together, right, of the subject and the artist, right? To talk about times also, back to the 90s, I think that it was really important for me personally, I bet for you as well, to be given an alternative to a kind of lush narrativity, right? This kind of like hyper-generous sort of autobiography, that we were given actually like a diversity of tools to actually find our own voices that, could be halting, not silence as annulling, but that silence could be a tool as well. And abstraction could be a tool, that space on the page could be a tool, that could be merged with performance, that could be merged with all sorts of different forms of production. And that all of it was actually possible, right?
Yeah, and in terms of writing, it was like, the immigrant experience does not need to be a testimonial, it's, or like, you being a witness almost to your own experience, but that it could be ugly and full of ugly feelings,
Or joy, or joy.
Yes, both ugly feelings and joy, yes, of course, can't forget joy.
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, if anyone in the audience has a question, if you could raise your hands and someone will come by and give you a note card to write any questions down. Please give us questions. We'd really appreciate it. And then, we'll take them in a bit. But just to, while people are, thinking and writing, I maybe wanted to go back to that phrase, ugly feelings, and ask about, because not like some of my worst breakups have been with like my female friends, right? And they're just so intense, like even more intense than any other. I mean, they're, as you said, they're like a kind of form of romantic relationship. And I'm wondering, like what if we could talk about those ugly feelings within, like envy or competition or, anger, if we could talk about those things existing in friendships as well.
There are definitely ugly feelings. I think there are ugly feelings in all close friendships, right? Especially friendships that last a long time and, where there's sometimes resentment builds, and that's also, I think, resentment is also an ugly feeling. But I think, when you're two friends, when you're friends with someone and you're very close and you're both in the same field, usually creative field, there's of course going to be competition. And competition, it's about having a balance, because I don't think competition is entirely a negative thing either. I think it could actually, it makes you work harder. You admire, you feel competitive with your friend because you really admire their work and you want to be as good as them, right? Or better. And so it could, in a way, it could also push you harder. But then at the same time, it can be, it can strain your friendship. It could lead to toxicity. And there were plenty of times where I was jealous of Jen because she was like, I sucked. I wasn't very good at art. And that's why I'm writing. But But Jen was very good, and and I will admit I was jealous, and I was,
I get jealous all the time.
I was
jealous all the
jealous,
time.
and that is a very ugly feeling to have. But I think it's also important. It's also good to just sort of admit it, right? But I think jealousy is a very common ugly feeling that it happens between friends. It could usually a lot of times it's over. Romantic relationships too. It's over a boy or a girl or what have you. Or another ugly feeling is like when your friend like you are spending all your time with your boyfriend, and feeling jealous because of that. And
I don't think it was jealousy. I remember actually. Yeah. We've
I
had
know
this,
how I felt.
Yeah, we've had conversations about that in the past. Yeah. I mean, it's standing up for the rights of your friendship. Is what that is. Yeah. And standing up for an investment, a prior investment that needs to continue into the future. You fight for your friendship, right? That's
noble
really
way to put it,
yes, it's very noble. It's not ugly at all. But yeah, ugly. I mean, it was one of the things that we grew through with each other was being like, oh right, I'm a horrible poet. Cathy, you're really good. And that also happened too. That was actually interesting that happened around the same time for both of us, right? So we both entered with both things, and then one took one, the other took the other, and
I felt it strangely at the time. I was like, "There's not room for." I don't know if it was racial. I don't think it had to do with like this idea of like scarcity. Like there can only be one Asian person in the art department. I don't think it had to do with that. I think it was just more like, I don't know. I was like, I'm giving art to Jen. Like I'll turn to writing. I don't know if that's even true. But
I don't know.
yeah, it is true. At some point, like our paths diverged. You got more into visual art. I got more into poetry, and then, but we still shared a lot of ideas about the concepts that we're working on, even if we were working in different mediums. I mean, I think what was also taught early on was that I learned early on to be very undisciplined about disciplines.
Yes.
It was like genre didn't matter.
Yeah.
Sticking to a genre didn't matter to me. And in fact, I still feel it to this day where when I see a genre, the first thing I want to do is trespass it, and I think that also has to do with like my early education, but also I think that also has to do with like writers like Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha who didn't think there wasn't one genre that was enough to capture her very complicated life history of migration. So she had to use them all, Yeah.
But I think I also want to just say, though, back to the ugly feelings, not to dwell on it, but I think that there are definitely like multi-year fights that we have. I mean, nothing to kill friendships or anything like that. But for instance, we've had an interesting many years fight, not to be ended anytime soon, about what is more ethically positioned, the writing world or the art world, And of course, like this is the conversation that happens after like 2 glasses of wine. So like clearly there's all sorts of unauthorized things that are said. But I think that, we grow out of that too. And I think the things that I learn from those disagreements go straight into my work, actually. And they help me grow through that, and help to articulate the kind of ethics and politics that I want in my own work.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, I think disagreement is also very important and very productive to art making and writing and so forth. Being able to argue, being comfortable with a friend, because I don't think I feel that comfortable with certain friends where I can just argue with them, and I could be as blunt and as honest as I want to be. And with Jen, I have that comfort, and I think that disagreement, that friction, is necessary for your for your practice as a writer or an artist.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. The way in which these types of friendships and built over years, like the types of friendships I've had, with friends, we've been in conversation about ideas forever, because we know each other and we have that basis. it actually makes the it's easier to disagree. You know, you don't have to worry about them getting like so mad at you because you already know like that there's a safety there, there's a basis to return to, and also I think that it also lets me disagree while giving someone the benefit of the doubt, which is I think kind of hard to do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So are there any if there are any questions, we'll take the note cards now. Thank you. And of course, while we're waiting, thank you to our amazing volunteers who are doing all this work, who are also students. So I'm going to just flip through these really quickly and choose a couple. I think that maybe while I'm doing this, I'm just wondering if you could talk about something that that Jen mentioned again earlier in an earlier conversation, which was about and I think that you both have already started to address this, but creative practices as a form of archiving and how maybe, Jen, that plays out in your work.
Okay. Oh, shoot. Yeah. I actually, it's hard for me to say. It's hard to start with that. I think that what we were talking about a little bit in the back was this idea, that I don't know, Cathy, help me.
I don't know. I think I kind of addressed it. I talked about it earlier, where I was doing my own archival work, right? By writing that essay. You mentioned before, you were talking about this before we came on, what was it, creative production or cultural production as archival work?
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
for instance, me writing an essay about our friendship is an example of that.
Exactly. I mean, the whole book itself as well is it's an archiving, right? In the production of it, it saves our story into perpetuity.
Because no one else is going to do it.
Yeah, who's going to do it for us? I don't want to take I feel like there's lots of interesting questions, but it's something on my mind a lot. What are the forms that are possible of an archive, and what if we any act of art making being something that if it is in fact meant to have some kind of timeline, some kind of perpetuity, right? Then it already becomes a kind of every art making being an act of archiving. But it's like I'm also working on a piece right now, which is scraping all these social media, kind of censored social media, and encrypting it into video files. So the video file itself becomes a actual body of archive all by itself that you can kind of unpack. I don't want to get too far into it, but that's definitely on my mind, right? And it's like something that's a big theme of these last 2 days, right? It's like what do we do as we look into the future, but also how do we actually reframe the past and recover, in fact, an art history that might be in
which takes a lot of imagination too. It's like not just sociological, archaeological, and so forth. It's also it's a combination of both inquiry and imagination, and it's goes back to what Saidiya Hartman was saying. What was she her whole project where she's trying to imagine the possibilities beyond the fiction that is history, and I think that is, which is what I'm personally interested in the work that I'm doing now, is that if the archive isn't there, so we're going to go back to this question of silence, right? There's no having to kind of another term that I heard was reconceiving your origins, right? It's what does it mean if you don't have the archive? It's just not there because of all the kind of totalizing erasure of people who came from developing nations. Then what do you do? What do you do with that silence? What do you do with that blank space? You could either leave it blank, like the way maybe Teresa Ha Kyung Ja did, or it becomes an aesthetic of speculations, which is what you could say like Saidiya Hartman. A lot of Saidiya Hartman's books are like, and that's also something that really interests me as well. You know?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about like speculations as a kind of interjection of like joy, humor, and possibility around like the kind of like skeleton or like the elbow bone that is found, right? How do you build a whole entire like a possible ecosystem and body in order to like step into the future with, right? So, how you doing over there?
Good. I'm. So I have to admit, I didn't listen to the answer to that last question because there's so many amazing questions that I'm trying very quickly to read, and I also am really bad at reading handwriting. But I'll do my best. Again, thank you so much for all of your questions. We'll make sure we read all of them, even if we're not able to read them all out loud. So the first question is. I've been struggling with how difficult it is to be an activist and how to put the burden of justice, and how the burden of justice is put on the oppressed when justice is unachievable. And the question is, like, how much did it hurt to write Minor Feelings? Was it worth it? And then thank you for all you do. Sorry, is that like such a hard question? They're all really hard questions, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Writing Minor Feelings was really hard, and because I'm not. Before I wrote Minor Feelings, I shied away from autobiography, and to use my own life, to mine from my own life as a writer was completely unprecedented for me, and it took a lot of rewriting. I mean, I think other writers will tell you this. You have to, the function of revision is also a way to kind of revise your way to the truth, because you're not going to get it at your first draft. You have to kind of work, get your nerve up to write what you perceive as is the truth. So it was really difficult. It was very difficult. But then I also realize, I always preach this to my students, that you have to write towards your discomfort. And I felt like this is what I needed to do, because if it's a source of discomfort, then there's something there. There's something beating, pulsing, whatever there, and you have to. And I am also a masochist, so I'm like, I have to see what's up. And of course, and it was completely and totally worth it. I felt very alone writing this book. And I didn't feel alone in terms of, I kept reading other books that inspired me, that really influenced me while I was working that, and I felt less alone reading this book. But I think overall, I felt really lonely writing this book, and I was, really afraid, certain that this book was just going to just like drop into the deep, endless well of obscurity and into the abyss, of the forgotten. And I was like, well, why am I writing about invisible race? The book is going to be invisible, and that was not the case. And it's like having so many people share their stories about how they felt seen or felt this kinship or related, or even people who argued with the book, because part of the book was also, I wanted it to be provocative too, because I wanted also, going back to this idea of disagreement, I think it's really important to disagree with a book, because if you agree with everything, how can you have conversation? And I was really heartened and inspired by that. So I think it's very important. In terms of the question of being an activist, this is a question I've gotten before, and it's really difficult, and you have to be worried about burnout, right? And I think that it's okay. It's not on only your shoulders. It's not just on your shoulders. It's like everyone's in it, and if you need to take a break, know that someone else will take the baton. But I think what we should fear most is about moving forward, and about, the biggest threat to activism is not actually the right, it's our own cynicism. It's our own indifference. It's, and this is what I'm afraid of, is that it's been a lot these last few years. It's been an onslaught with Trump, January 6th, pandemic, anti-Asian hate, George Floyd. It's been a lot. And it's like, and also, in one sense, we have to give ourselves a break, but we cannot sink into cynicism. We can't sink into our own fatigue, because it's more important than ever that we continue this struggle, and that fight might mean something different for each and every one of you. But I feel that way too. I'm tired, but we can't be tired. You can take a break, but don't take a break for too long, Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I also, I feel like I don't have anything prescriptive to say, but I think it's been really important, certainly for me, and I think for you, to kind of to not fall into easy binaries of art versus activism. I think that there's all sorts of overlaps, different types of overlaps, and different types of grays there that can be really fulfilling for anybody. But once we force ourselves into one or the other, then it's easy to get burnt out, because perhaps there's another part of you that's just unattended to, right?
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that's important too. I think especially identity has become, there's been such a retrenchment of identity within the last few years, both from the right and the left. And from the left, what you're seeing, and a lot of this has been sort of fomented by social media, is this sort of kind of turf war of identity, where identity is treated as this kind of intellectual property. And it's like, what has dismayed me is like how territorial it's gotten. And it's like really, and I say this all the time, even when we're talking about like Asian American identity, that I don't think of it as a category. I don't think of it as like a brand. I don't think of it as a hashtag. For me, it's action, it's oppositional. It's like, it's one of the many nodes in which you build alliances with many different groups. It's much more plastic, flexible than that. But which has been discussed, and people have made that point over and over again these last 2 days, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I will say that the thing I always say to my students when they ask me that is the institution wants you to make its structural problems individual problems, So we have several questions actually about, the way your friendship has changed over the years. I think it's kind of maybe summed up in like someone who asks, there's a lot of attention to, formative periods in kind of young adulthood, but what about like, this moment in kind of, middle adulthood and friendship? Like what happens in terms of kind of emotional intimacy or belonging?
We still do Thanksgiving every year.
Oh, really?
And we've gotten really to be really good cooks. So we eat a lot.
What do you make?
Everything.
Jen's a really good cook.
Cathy,
Yeah.
you're good.
I'm okay.
We drink less.
Yeah, there's a lot. I get hungover when I have 2 glasses of wine now. It's so sad.
Weren't we just talking about your diary from when you were younger?
Oh yeah, just
my
like them. We're not going to go into that. We're like, we were joking before. We're like, we're just going to talk about how we were drunk all the time and just really bore everyone. But I think that our friendship has remained fairly consistent. I mean, of course, we had different life trajectories. I'm married with a child. I think I had more of a heteronormative, conventional path, right? With a child, and I stayed in New York, whereas Jen, you have a partner, but, you kind of moved around more. And, large bulk of our friendship was also just long distance, and there would be many, many months where I wouldn't see Jen, but I think that's also the beauty of a friendship that you've known someone for so long, is that you could just not be in contact for 5 months and then pick up where you left off, as if you just saw that friend yesterday. Yeah.
But I think one of the things that I think that we always maintained, whether explicitly or just sort of unsaid, was that friendship is something that can die, right? And so one must invest in that friendship, actually, right? You actually have to spend the time.
Yes.
So if nothing else, I think middle age, fine. I mean, it can be harder to carve out the time and to be really deliberate. One has to make deliberate choices to make that time, but it's so important.
Yeah, that's really important. This feels like a really important question. So I noticed you described female relationships as friendships. Where does queerness fit in? Lesbianism, romantically or politically?
Gray shades? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think we're there. I don't really make any kind of distinction. As I was saying earlier before, female friendships in college are often romantic, and perhaps there is some latent desire there too, latent sexual desire, that sort of, that's also kind of attracting these friendships. I don't, again, I don't believe that there are hard lines between heterosexual friendships and lesbian friendships, and I think it's all kind of very fluid, and there was definitely, especially with Helen, there was definitely some, you could say that there was definitely sort of this, she was queer, and there was definitely that kind of, at the time, I don't know how she identifies now, but there was definitely,
I'm going to redirect.
Okay.
So
good friend.
Thanks. I think that one of the most intense, not one of the most intense. There's lots of intensities. One of the brutalities of heteronormativity, I think, is to to silo intimacy, and it's absolutely this is not correct for my life, at the very least. And yeah, I think that our kind of friendship could not survive in that kind of intense compartmentalization. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the last question of the day is a really good one. What would you each say to the 20-year-old version of yourself? And of each other, sorry. What would you each say to the 20-year-old versions of each other, but maybe also of yourself?
Wait, 20-year-old or 17-year-old?
I'm sure it
You should tell me not to get those tattoos. Tell me not to get those tattoos when I'm 16, 17. You did?
I did tell you.
You didn't. You did?
I told you as a 20-year-old. I don't need to tell you now. It's like a 46-year-old looking back.
Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine.
Yes.
Yeah, it's so simple.
I know. Don't be so hard on yourself.
No, be hard on yourself, but
Really?
Well, be hard on yourself, but not towards a kind of a spinning neurosis, right? We're hard on ourselves. That's just part of the.
Sometimes hard to tell the difference, though.
Well, yeah, sure. But that everything was going to be fine.
Yeah.
Is that too?
No,
amazing.
it's perfect.
Yeah. It's too smug.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.